Why is the janitor still in here? Get him out before the board sees this mess. Marcus Webb barely looked up from the floor he was mopping, because looking up was a thing that drew attention, and attention was a thing Marcus had learned 40 years ago to avoid. The CEO, a man named Richard Hastings, in the job 3 years, loud in the way men get loud when they're afraid nobody's listening, stood in the doorway of the boardroom with his phone in one hand and his certainty in the other. "Sir, I'm just cleaning," Marcus said, even and plain. "I can see what you're doing. The question is why you're doing it now. We have a shareholder meeting in 20 minutes. This room needs to be presentation ready. Not," he waved a hand at Marcus and the mop and the bucket of water that had been there since 6 a.m. "Not like this. Leave, come back after." Marcus was 73 and had been cleaning that boardroom every morning for 40 years. And he'd learned in those 40 years that there were two kinds of men who ran companies. The kind who saw a person when they looked at a janitor, and the kind who saw a problem. Hastings was the problem kind. But what Hastings did not know, what he could not have known, seeing only the mop and the dark hands holding it, and the assumption that came with both, was that the man he was ordering out of the room had built the company that room was part of, had founded it on a principle that started with every person being seen, and had kept cleaning that boardroom every morning for decades specifically so he would never forget what that principle meant. Marcus Vance had started the company in 1994 with $300, a business license, and a promise he'd made to himself on his knees, scrubbing other people's floors. He'd been 28 then, working night shifts at an office building downtown, cleaning the floors of a consulting firm, watching the men in suits make decisions that cost other men their livelihoods, and deciding that if he ever got the chance to build something, he would build it on the idea that the person cleaning the floor and the person in the suit were doing equally important work, and that you didn't get to sit in a chair making decisions about people if you wouldn't sit down and listen to them first. So he'd started small. A janitorial service, him and 2 other men he knew from the building, doing contract work for small companies. And he'd undercut the competition because he worked harder, and he'd treated every client like a partner instead of a transaction, and he'd insisted on knowing the names of the people he was working for and the challenges they were facing. Within 5 years, he had 12 contracts. Within 10, 40, and somewhere along the way, while staying the founder, he'd also stayed the janitor, came in every morning at 6, took the mop to the boardroom and the offices and the common spaces. Because if you stopped doing the work, you stopped understanding the work. And Marcus had made himself a promise that he'd never be a man who forgot what his company was actually built to do. The company had grown into something big enough that he could have stopped. He'd been offered partnerships, acquisition, the usual paths for a man with a successful business. But Marcus had turned them all down because he'd understood something that Rich Hastings had never learned, which was that the moment you stop doing the work is the moment you stop being able to lead the people who do it. So he'd stayed. He'd hired managers and given them authority, but he'd kept coming in at 6 with his mop, because staying connected to the work was how you knew when the work was being done right and when it was being done wrong, and when the principles you'd built the company on were still alive or dying. And then, 3 years ago, he'd hired Richard Hastings to run operations, thinking he'd found a man who understood. And slowly, imperceptibly, the company had started to drift. The janitorial contracts were being squeezed for more profit. The cleaning standards were being cut. The relationships with clients were becoming transactional again. And somewhere in it, Marcus had realized that he'd hired a man who'd never cleaned a floor in his life, who saw work as a thing that other people did, who had no bone-deep understanding of what happened when you treated people like problems instead of partners. Marcus had kept coming in at 6 anyway. He'd kept mopping that boardroom. And he'd kept watching the way he watched everything to see when the break would come. It came that morning, 20 minutes before the board showed up, with Richard Hastings in his expensive suit telling a 73-year-old black man to get out of the room he'd built the company in. Marcus set down his mop. He didn't argue. That wasn't his way. He was gathering his bucket and his tools when the first board member came through the door. It was Catherine Reed, the chief financial officer, and she stopped dead when she saw Marcus, and her face went through something. Surprise, then recognition, then the particular kind of shame that comes when you realize what you've almost walked past. "Mr. Vance," she said, and she said it the way you say a man's name when he's your boss, and the respect in it was so clear that Richard Hastings went still. "I was just leaving," Marcus said. "Quiet no," Catherine said. And she put a hand on his arm, gentle, and she turned to face the door. One by one, the board members arrived. Thomas Liu, the COO, came in and saw Marcus, and his eyes went wide, and he stood straighter, literally stood taller, and greeted him. Jennifer Hayes, the general counsel. David Okonkwo, who oversaw operations. Every single person who walked into that boardroom saw the 73-year-old man with the mop and the bucket, and every single person, without a word being spoken, understood what was happening. They all stood, all of them, in a line, facing Marcus Vance like soldiers facing a general, and Catherine, who was nearest, extended her hand and said the only thing that needed saying. "Good morning, sir. Thank you for being here." Richard Hastings looked from the board members to Marcus to the mop and bucket and understood in stages what he'd just done. The color went out of his face. I didn't know," he started. "That's the problem," Marcus said, and his voice was quiet, and it was gentle, and it was the most devastating thing anyone in that room had ever heard. "If you'd known, you wouldn't have treated this man that way, because you would have known who I am. But you should have treated him that way regardless, because every man deserves to be seen." He set down his bucket and looked at the board members and at the man who'd hired to run his company, and he made a decision he'd been circling for a long time now. "I'm going to retire," Marcus said. "I'm going to pass the company to people who understand what we built it to be. And Richard, you're going to step down as CEO, effective today. Not because I'm angry. I'm not. You just forgot who you were working for. And once a man forgets that, he can't lead people anymore." He turned to Catherine. "You take it. You and Jennifer and David. The three of you remember what this place is supposed to be. Make it that again." The reckoning was procedural, and it was clean. By the time the shareholder meeting started, the board had voted in new leadership, and the company's founding principle, that no person was beneath another, that the work defined you, not the title, was being re-established. Richard Hastings left the building that afternoon, and Marcus stayed for the meeting, not in a seat, but standing at the back, watching the company he'd built remember itself. The grace was what nobody expected. After the meeting, Marcus asked to speak to Hastings privately, and the two men sat alone in an office that Hastings would no longer have a key to. "I'm not going to ruin you," Marcus said. "You made a mistake. You'll make a lot more mistakes in your life because that's what people do. But you'll either learn from them or you won't, and that's on you." He stood. "What I will do is make sure every company in this city knows what happened here today. And I'll make sure they understand that if they hire you and you treat people the way you treated that man this morning, people will know and people will remember. That's not revenge. That's just consequences." Hastings nodded, and there was something in his face that might have been the beginning of understanding or might have been just fear. Marcus didn't stay to find out. The coda came 6 months on, and it came with Marcus stepping fully back and Catherine Reed running the company with the same principle Marcus had always run it on, that you don't lead people you won't work beside. And the company thrived because of it, because the people who worked there understood that they were seen, and being seen is the deepest thing a company can offer a person. Marcus came in sometimes, after retirement, still with his mop, still cleaning the boardroom, because the habit was in his bones and the work was in his blood, and because staying connected to what you've built is the only way to know if it's still alive. And on the wall of the boardroom, the board had hung a small plaque, simple, with just one line on it, Marcus's founding principle. The thing he'd written in a notebook the day he started the company, the thing he'd lived 40 years to prove. You don't get to sit in a chair making decisions about people if you won't sit down and listen to them first. And every time a new employee came into that room, they'd ask about the plaque. And someone would tell them the story of the day a CEO tried to order the founder out of his own boardroom, and how the board stood for the janitor instead, and what that meant about what the company actually was. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't know who they were dismissing, and chosen to let them learn the consequences without destroying them, tell us about it in the comments. We read everyone. The moral is as plain as a mop and bucket. The work defines you more than the title, and the man who won't do the work is the man who can't lead the people who do. Leadership isn't about authority. It's about being seen and doing the seeing. And the moment you stop being willing to work beside the people you're leading is the moment you stop deserving to lead them. Who was the first person who taught you that work was no shame? That staying connected to the actual doing of a thing was how you understood it? Tell us below. If Marcus's morning meant something to you, share it with someone who's being told they're beneath the notice of people in suits. And wherever you're working today, whether you're pushing a mop or pushing a company, may you work in a place where being seen matters, where the person cleaning the floor is greeted before the person in the chair, and where the deepest respect goes to the ones who never forgot that they started on their knees.